No one could explain when it truly began. Perhaps not even James himself. One morning, as the fog of early winter wrapped around the quiet village, Dieppe noticed it. A stillness in his eyes that didn't belong to him. James had always carried storms, yes, but they moved, they thundered, they flashed with life. Now, that storm was frozen, trapped behind a sheet of ice she couldn't break. He returned home later than usual, his shoulders heavy, his steps uncertain. Even Yi, who usually ran to him with wild excitement, stopped midway and simply stared, as if sensing something unfamiliar in the man she adored. James tried to smile, but the corners of his mouth barely lifted. His voice was calm, almost too calm, calm in a way that felt like surrender. "Are you tired?" Dieppe asked gently. James only nodded, removing his coat with mechanical motions. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone. He sat at the edge of the table, rubbing his thumb against his palm as if trying to warm hands that would not warm. The nights were worse. Dieppe would wake up and find him standing by the window, staring into the darkness outside. Sometimes he didn't even hear her footsteps approaching. "James, are you okay?" she whispered. His response was always the same, a hollow, "I'm fine." But the longer he said it, the more the words felt like a wall rising between them. Dieppe tried everything. She prepared his favorite dishes, sat beside him in silence, held his hand when he allowed her to. But James now flinched to tenderness. He withdrew, hiding behind an invisible shield he once promised he'd never use against her. It wasn't anger, it wasn't rejection, it was something deeper, something that looked like fear, disguised as coldness. People in the village began whispering, "Has he changed his mind about her? Is something wrong with the company again? Why does he look like a man who's lost everything?" But Dieppe knew it wasn't business that haunted him. There was a different heaviness in his shoulders, a haunting too personal to be tied to numbers or contracts. And when James returned one night with his eyes red, as though he'd been fighting ghosts, Dieppe felt a truth forming in her heart. James was not cold because he stopped loving her. James was cold because something in his past was slowly pulling him away. And she feared that one day he might not find his way back. The truth revealed itself slowly, like a bruise surfacing beneath the skin. One evening, after hours of silence, James finally spoke, not with clarity, not with strength, but with a trembling that startled Dieppe. "My father came to see me today." Those 7 words were enough to make her heart tighten. She had only seen James's father once, but the coldness in the man's eyes was unforgettable. It was the same coldness James tried so hard to hide, the same coldness that now threatened to swallow him whole. Dieppe didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her hand resting gently over his. "He told me I owe him everything," James whispered, bitterness coating his voice. "The company, the reputation, even my future. He said, I'm nothing without him." Dieppe's breath caught. "What did he say?" "What could I say?" James looked away. "It's the same thing he's repeated since I was a boy." And there it was, the truth she had never fully known. James had not become cold. He had been raised in coldness. He told her about the nights his father made him stand outside in the freezing air because he didn't complete his studies perfectly. About the times he earned first place and was told it wasn't enough. About the years he inherited a company built on foundations of fear, manipulation, and silence. "You think I became strong," he said quietly, "but I only became numb." Dieppe felt tears burn the corners of her eyes. She reached for his hand again, but he pulled away, gently, apologetically. "That's what scares me.
Every time you touch me, I feel how much I want to break down. And I can't. Not now. Not when he's watching everything I do." "James," Dieppe leaned closer. "You don't have to face him alone." But James shook his head. "He wants to destroy everything I've built, and he knows the fastest way to break me," he swallowed hard, "is you." Suddenly, the coldness made sense. His distance wasn't rejection, it was protection. A desperate, painful attempt to shield her from a man who had never hesitated to use cruelty as a weapon. Dieppe felt a chill run through her, but she refused to let fear silence her. "Whatever he's trying to do, we will face it together." James finally looked at her. Really looked. His eyes were tired, wounded, yet searching, as if trying to believe her words could carry enough strength for both of them. But the shadow of his father still lingered, dark and terrible, and yet realized with a trembling heart. The battle James feared was not against the world. It was against the man who raised him. For days after the confrontation with his father, James moved like a man carrying an invisible boulder on his shoulders. He threw himself into work, not with the intensity of a leader, but with the desperation of someone running from a truth too heavy to face. His staff felt the chill in his voice. Even Dieppe, who tried to reach through his silence, was met with a wall so cold it frightened her. But she did not give up. One late evening, she entered his office without knocking. Papers were scattered across the desk, the room dim except for the glow of the computer screen. James sat hunched, unmoving. He didn't look up until she quietly placed a cup of warm tea beside him. "James," she said softly, "you can't keep pretending you're fine." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a bitter laugh, one so hollow it made her chest tighten. "Fine?" he repeated. "I built my life believing I could outrun the man who raised me. I told myself I would never become him. And now I find out I've been living off the ruins he created." His voice cracked, not loudly, but enough that Dieppe felt it like a cut. She stepped closer. "James, you are not your father." "No," James whispered. "I'm worse, because I wasn't brave enough to confront the truth. I let it grow, rot, poison everything. My company, my people, you." "That's not true," she insisted, but he didn't seem to hear her. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I always wondered why he never showed me warmth, why he looked at me not like a son, but like a reminder of something he hated." He swallowed hard. "Now I know. I was the proof of his sins." The next generation meant to inherit the consequences of what he did. Dieppe knelt beside him, her eyes meeting his from below. "James, you are allowed to be angry. You're allowed to be hurt. But don't let pain rewrite the man you've become." His breath trembled. "Dieppe, do you think I deserve happiness?" She did not hesitate. "Yes, more than anyone I know." Her certainty shook him more than any truth he had uncovered. Slowly, hesitantly, James leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. It wasn't a kiss nor a confession. It was the quiet surrender of a man who had been fighting alone for too long. For the first time in days, the ice around him began to crack. The next morning, James woke with a rare sense of clarity. Dieppe's presence the night before had not magically healed him, but it had given him something he desperately needed: permission to breathe. For the first time, he felt he did not have to carry the weight alone. But fate was not ready to let him rest. As he arrived at the office, Tuan rushed toward him, panic carved across his face. "James, we have a problem, a serious one." James straightened. "What happened?" Tuan hesitated, lowering his voice. "Someone leaked the old land case involving your family. It's all over the investor groups. People are pulling out. The board is demanding an explanation." James's jaw tightened as a familiar coldness swept through him. Not the emotional numbness that had frightened Yep, but the sharp, controlled calm of a man preparing for war. "Set up a meeting. I will speak to them." Within an hour, the conference room filled with investors, shareholders, and legal advisors. Their expressions were stiff, accusatory, impatient. For years, they had admired James's competence, but admiration could vanish instantly when money was threatened. One of the older investors stood up. "James, is it true that your father illegally seized land decades ago? That your wealth, our company's foundation, is tied to a crime?" Every eye turned to him. James inhaled slowly. "Yes, it's true." A murmur swept the room. Shock, outrage, relief that someone had finally said it. "But," James continued, voice steady, "I was not aware of it until days ago. And I refuse to let the sins of a past generation destroy the future we've built." Another shareholder scoffed. "That's noble, but noble doesn't pay losses." Before tempers could escalate, the door swung open. It was Deep. She hadn't meant to interrupt, but her footsteps echoed in the silent room. James turned to her, surprised, but in her eyes he found the grounding he needed. "Mr. James," she said respectfully, though her voice was trembling, "you always taught your team not to abandon the company in difficult times. I believe that should apply to everyone here." The room stiffened. A company's strength is not measured by its past, but how its people stand together when the past tries to break them. Her bravery stunned the room, and it stunned James even more. For the first time that day, he felt hope. But lurking outside the building, watching the entire scene unfold from a distance, was John. Smiling. Because he knew the storm had only just begun. Lesson, written as a reflective essay. In the story of James and Di, the greatest lesson lies not in the dramatic events that surrounded them, but in the quiet truths hidden beneath those struggles. We often believe that strength is measured by how well we conceal our pain, how firmly we hold ourselves together even when the world begins to collapse. James lived by this belief for years. He buried his emotions, distanced himself from the people who cared, and carried the weight of his family's history alone. It made him cold, not because he wanted to be, but because he feared that if anyone saw the cracks in him, everything he built would fall apart. But the truth is far more human. No one can walk through storms alone. Di's presence reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that vulnerability is not weakness, and companionship is not a burden. When she stepped into that boardroom and spoke for him, she did more than defend his reputation. She showed him that love is not measured in words whispered in peaceful moments, but by the courage to stand beside someone when the world turns against them. Another important lesson is that the past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way back to us. James could not escape the shadow of his father's mistakes. Yet what defines a person is not the legacy they inherit, but the choices they make when that legacy is revealed. By facing the truth openly, James proved that responsibility is not about denying what came before, but about choosing a better path forward. Finally, the story teaches us that difficult times reveal the true nature of relationships. Some people step back when trouble comes. Others step forward. Di stepped forward. And in doing so, she became the anchor that steadied James when everything else was slipping away. In the end, the lesson is simple. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep moving with someone who believes in you. Love is not tested in calm waters, it is proven in storms. And healing begins the moment we allow someone to take our hand and walk through the darkness with us.